Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. Today we are wrapping up our series Apocalypse Soon, where we read books on climate or environmental fiction. If you're listening to us for the first time, you can join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. You can find that by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. And if you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's also in the episode description. Next week, we will be starting our new series, Bad Adaptation, where we discuss good books that were turned into bad movies. That was actually suggested to us by a listener, so thank you, kind listener. We are starting with Highrise by Jg Ballard. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we still have to talk about climate change.
So the three of us, I would say, we're all pretty big nerds and we care a lot about books and we read a lot. But do these books talking about climate change really matter in the overall way that we as a species, as human beings, are going to address climate change? And Sam and I have been talking on Reddit a lot about this, and I've told Sam before several times that I am very doubtful. I don't really see the novel as a place for the public, in America at least, to work through ideas. And I was thinking about this, and I came across a series of remarks at a 2018 science fiction symposium on climate change in science fiction, and those remarks complicated the issue for me. First, Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a quite vocal climate change advocate. Well, it's not an advocate. What's the word for him? He's a climate change. He's an activist.
He has a boner for climate change.
Yes, a giant boner for climate change and many other things. He said that dystopian climate fiction is useful for, quote, sounding the alarm. But Robinson prefers what he calls utopian visions. And those visions can seize climate change as an opportunity for post-capitalist justice, changing the world that we live in for the better. He says that those are good stories to tell and the kind of science fiction that we need now. What do you make of what he's saying here? Is that really important? Is that the way that science fiction should be going?
I don't know. I want Robinson to be right. I'm all for trying to get toward post-capitalism, but it feels really out of touch. I feel like he's someone who has either not been reading the news lately or reads the news and just says, you know what would be really cool is if.
Well, why do you say that, Sam? What is it about the news now that makes this seem so unlikely?
I feel like for this kind of thing to happen, for post-capitalism to become a thing, for a utopian society to come about, you can't have this polar opposite effect that we're seeing in the US and the world over, really, right now, where we have very strong populist opinions, very strong capitalist views and proponents, and very strong people against those things.
So what about the other opposite kind of use of science fiction to sound the alarm? Do you think that works?
Yeah, but I get his point that we're already getting that. The alarm has been sounded for quite some time and it continues to ring out, but still nothing is being done about it, or very little.
Do you say then that all of the people who would care about climate change already know about it? Or do the people who care about climate change care as much as they should about it?
I want to say no on both counts. I think fiction does things that no other medium can in approaching these big ideas, and that it might be the only place to work through these kinds of ideas, taking the data and making it more relevant to the individual. And I think that's the only way to reach the people that we haven't already reached. I also do think that those of us who care probably can care more. The difference is spurring those of us who do care into action.
I have to say that these books, they got me feeling some feelings. So I cared before, and I care a little bit more now after reading these books and thinking about climate change more than I usually do. So in one respect, the impact is there, but I don't think it's a significant enough impact that we can rely on it for any sort of, transformative political change. And I think that the pandemic really shows me that this is true because people do have a reaction to dystopian situations, but I don't think there is a matching impulse towards utopian thinking in situations where things seem to be in danger and there is a lot on the line. I think this is my impression that even though people don't admit it, what they really like is normalcy. They really love the status quo. And what they really hate is something changing and creating a new normal. Nobody really actually wants that. People say that they do, but I don't think they actually do.
I agree, but I think if anything's to be done, we have to get out of our comfort zones. I think the way we get into these situations is by doing nothing. I don't know if any of these books really highlight this, but this is such a larger issue than any individual can really tackle. I mean, you can do your recycling, but we can have a whole discussion on how useful that it really is. Policy is what needs to change, but how do you get there? Is fiction going to change policy? I don't know. Probably not.
So, dystopian fiction is focused on problems, and utopian fiction presents solutions. Do readers want to read fiction that presents answers?
I would say no, only because it's much more poetic to show an unsolved problem. When you show the answer, it often seems a little bit tidy, a little bit too facile. The three of us, as kind of the genesis of this podcast, we read New York 2140. And I think we all reacted the same way to the ending of that book, which was very simple, in my reading at least. It was like he was guiding them by the hand towards this kind of collectivist mindset. And suddenly everyone seemed to agree with Kim Stanley Robinson.
I think that goes to the heart of the problem, which is that when people read fiction, they're not reading for solutions, generally speaking. They're reading because problems are much more interesting. Problems are what create drama. It's really hard to structure drama around a solution. Though I will say I'm looking forward to our series a few months from now when we will be reading contemporary utopias. So we'll look at this in more detail. But my understanding is that utopias are really tricky, very difficult to write because of this very issue. Like, fiction is not about that. Fiction is about drama that comes from problems.
I would say, yes, I agree with you if you're talking about good fiction. Like, if you're talking about making good art comes from problems rather than solutions. But at the same time, this isn't just about making good art, but about saving the world. And in that respect, I would say it might be okay to make some bad art that offers what seems like a very simple answer if the simple answer being offered is correct. To my mind, I would say that it's not going to happen in science fiction only because it works for somebody who's already an anti-capitalist, like Kim Stanley Robinson. But for most people, like 90% of the reading public, I think the argument for self-preservation has to come separately from the argument for anti-capitalism.
Because the vast majority of us aren't there.
I mean, if you were asked, what could replace capitalism as a viable political and economic structure for your country, you wouldn't know what to say. But I bet Kim Stanley Robinson would. And I think most of us are in that boat where it's like, yeah, it might be bad, but something new could be even worse. And trying to show somebody why climate change is a serious problem is already enough work for the novelist. Convincing somebody that radical restructuring of his society is also necessary, to my mind, is doing too much at once.
The more I read about Robinson, the more I think he would be fun at a party, though.
Maybe an orgy?
Yeah, maybe I'd keep him away from the young nubile women, but, I'd talk to him.
You remember in New York 2140, there's this young stockbroker, and he has sex with an older woman.
So I'd keep him away from all of the women, I guess. Okay, fine.
Yeah, no, the tagline in the novel was like, and she certainly knew how to have sex. That's his thing, right? It's like, don't forget that we old timers can still fuck. In that same series of remarks, I came across something from Professor Stephen Shaviro, and he turned the conversation back to the hyperobjects that we discussed in the last episode when we were talking about The Man with the Compound Eyes by Wu Mingyi. Shaviro says that these hyperobjects, which are these objects that are so massive and distributed in time and space that human beings have difficulty understanding them, such as climate change, such as a collection of plastics in the world, all of these things that are really difficult to think about. Shaviro says that these are, quote, the privileged objects of science fiction. And he draws on a definition of science fiction as one whose referents defy literal representation. So the things that science fiction writes about are things that cannot be represented literally. In a very compelling way, I would say that fiction, if not only science fiction, as he's saying, can present hyperobjects to the human imagination. But if they are presented to humans, will people actually pay attention?
So why is fiction the only form that can present hyperobjects?
In my understanding, what makes a hyperobject is that it doesn't exist in front of you in a tangible way, an understandable way. You think about like microplastic particles, like there are billions of particles, trillions probably, of these particles of plastic that will not biodegrade, and they're floating around in our world. But we can't see them, and they're not collected in one place. So they only really become active to the human mind when a writer comes upon an occasion to talk about them. And I think that science fiction is the genre where the writer often has that occasion. He uses science fiction's ability to talk about the unreal to activate them in some unusual way. Like we saw in The Man with the Compound Eyes, where this big island of plastic smashes into Taiwan. I guess the bigger question that I have here in response to Shaviro is, do you guys agree with this hyperobject category? Is this something real? And if it is something real, is this something that normal people need to be paying attention to?
I get the term hyperobjects. They are things that should be focused on, but I don't know that people need to know the definition of hyperobjects, I guess. Like, I think they are things that do need to be tackled in fiction and science fiction.
I don't know if I totally get a hyperobject. I feel like the word hyperobject is a hyperobject for me. In a way, I like it because that's kind of what makes science fiction interesting. And I think people who are drawn to science fiction will be drawn to hyperobjects. But not everyone is drawn to science fiction. Some people just want to read Nicholas Sparks, for example.
That's true. I mean, not everybody who should know about things will always be in a position to access them. I do agree with the hyperobject idea, but I am not sold on everybody needing to pay attention to hyperobjects. Here, I don't mean knowing them as hyperobjects, but even knowing that they exist. I think what Shaviro is saying here, by kind of privileging science fiction as a method of getting people to deal with these hard to deal with concepts, is actually kind of populist in the sense that it would still matter that people know about these concepts. If they know about the amount of plastic waste, or if they know about the rising sea levels or the overall temperatures increasing. I think that as a method for dealing with climate change, people paying attention to this is the wrong way. This is something that Sam shared a while back on our subreddit, talking about Lydia Millett's novel, A Children's Bible. In that interview, I think Lydia Millett gets it exactly right, because she says this: We have normal jobs, so how do we tackle these huge future oriented abstractions? It's a tactic that has been used by climate change deniers and by vested interests in big industry. Just tell people they should recycle and guilt them about their own lifestyles when it's really macro social things that determine our lifestyles. It's laws, it's policies. I think that that's exactly right because if we have good policy, if we have good politics, it doesn't matter if people actually personally know that the sea levels are rising. People don't need to deal with hyperobjects. Focusing on dealing with hyperobjects is kind of avoiding the political responsibility that our leaders have to deal with this themselves.
Right. But where the hyperobjects come into play to the individual is that it gets the individual more educated and more aware of the problems at hand. So that even if we can't do anything on the individual level, we can either get angry enough that we collect and, amass together, or we force those that are supposed to be representing us to do their jobs and enact policies that actually help.
Here's where I get really controversial. I think that with most kind of crises, that response is the correct one. But in terms of climate change, even though I normally agree very strongly with democratic ideals, I don't know if democracy is going to get us to the solution to climate change. I think that we need real leadership beyond just the leaders doing what people want and moving towards leaders doing what should happen rather than what we want to happen.
So your pitch is for an enlightened monarchy. That's what will solve our climate change problems.
Not in terms of monarchy, but I mean, basically, in one sense, what Robinson wants to happen will happen, even though we're not going to work towards a post-capitalist future, because any solution that our leaders would come up with under the direction of actual experts would be, to my understanding, anti-capitalist, because the solution is never going to be what works for business interests. And in that sense, I think what's going to happen is the government is going to have to impose serious limitations on what businesses can do and what certain practices are and are not acceptable. And the businesses aren't going to follow those practices and those policies willingly. But I also think it's anti-democratic because I don't know if the people will actually vote for these policies or vote to be represented by the people who would choose those policies.
The feeling I get is that the things that need to happen will eventually, but the main question is a matter of time. Will those things be done in a timely manner before it's too late, or are they going to be enacted well past their due date?
I mean, when is too late? Do we wait until we lose the California coastline? Do we wait until we lose Lower Manhattan?
That's what I'm saying. There are some people probably that would argue it's already too late. What I'm saying is that we're arguing for these things to change now, but by your own admission, a lot of these changes are anti-democratic, at least in our current society, and that by the time the veil is lifted and everyone understands that things need to change, by then it's going to be way too late.
The intermediate step here, Iad, that you've kind of glossed over is that liberal democracy in its current form cannot solve climate change. I don't know if you want to spend any time talking about this, but I don't think that this is the majority opinion. Even among people who subscribe to climate change, that believe in the science, I don't think they hold this opinion.
Absolutely. I don't think that this is a mainstream opinion at all. This is my personal feeling on the matter, and I'm sure lots of people out there disagree with me, but I just feel like we don't have the time to wait for people to get on board with this. I think it's a matter of people in a car and they're hurtling towards a cliff and they're debating, should we step on the brakes?
And similarly, the intermediate step is that capitalism can't solve climate change either.
Yes, that I feel more certain of, but again, I'm sure other people will disagree.
I am kind of behind you on this one, Ed. I feel like in most cases, there probably are some, entrepreneurial ideas that can help a few businesses in fighting climate change. But in general, I feel like most changes that need to happen are going to be difficult for businesses to get around. They're going to be difficult for a capitalist society to deal with. It's going to cost money.
I think that when you talk about the value of the humanities and the value of the novel in this process, it's still very democratic because it still says that it matters that the mass of people know about this and the mass of people care about this. And to my mind, at this point in time, I don't think that it matters that much how people feel. I think that we have reached a state of emergency where it's not that important.
If we turn this back to your initial question of what fiction can do to address climate change, I think one thing it can do is it can normalize this kind of wholesale change in the way things are done. I mean, not just in fiction. There's nothing special about fiction, but just media and entertainment in general, I think can normalize that kind of shift in thinking.
Yes, it can. I think that in an ideal world, that would be very significant. If everybody started to feel that significant changes were necessary, and because of that sentiment, significant changes started to be made, that would be wonderful. But I just don't really think that we have the time for that to happen. And I just think that it might not ever happen.
If it is indeed too late, and there are people who are thinking along these lines, then the question isn't how to avoid climate change or solve climate change, but it's how to deal with climate change, how to live with climate change. So what I want to talk about here actually is really related to what you're saying, Ed, which is how fiction can cause people to change their minds. I actually, with my free time largely focused on taking care of kids, I did not know that a new Dune movie was coming out, but apparently it is. But I did think about Dune when I started thinking about climate fiction, because Dune is one of the first and one of the most well-known ecological novels. I'm sure most people know about Dune, but it's set on the desert planet of Arrakis. And one of the most striking scenes of the novel, the main character, Paul Atreides, kills a Fremen, who is a native to the planet of Dune. And then afterwards, he's given the water from the dead man's body, because water is such a precious resource on the planet Arrakis that even when a person dies, the water is conserved. So this killing inducts Paul into the Fremen, but it also teaches him the importance of water conservation. What's interesting is this death ritual, which is very different from Earth death rituals, has a rhetorical purpose because it also inducts the reader into this culture of extreme conservation. So the reason why I brought this up is in 2012, researchers Jeff Kaufman and Lisa Libby conducted experiments to see if fiction could change behavior. And what they found was that, yes, fiction could, in fact, alter a person's behavior. They called this phenomenon experience taking. And they found that, quote, the greater the ability of a reader to simulate the subjective experience of a character, the greater the potential that story has to change the reader's self-concept, attitudes, and behavior. And in the study, they found that the most effective forms of experience taking, which is kind of, I guess, an extreme form of empathy, the most effective forms were caused by three factors. One, first-person narratives. Two, the out-group identity was introduced later in the story rather than from the start. And three, when the reader was less aware of their own experience. So, defining some of these terms, outgroup identity in the study was Black and homosexual identity. So, these students, presumably they were not Black or homosexual, though I'm not sure, I didn't read the whole study. They read narratives that featured a Black character or a homosexual character. And the experiment tested whether or not their attitudes toward these people changed. And this idea of their own experience when a reader was less aware of their own experience, that's talking about how they see themselves. So in one version of the experiment, they had a mirror in front of the reader that reflected himself or herself. And those participants were less likely to experience this shift, whereas readers who were focused on being a more generic person, less themselves, but an average person, that reader was able to identify more with these out-group people that were featured in the book. So, in effect, this study is saying that if a narrative has these traits, first person, first of all, the out-group identity was introduced later, second of all, and the reader was less aware of their own experience. I don't know how the writer could control that, but I also understand it as an immersion, like a very extreme, captivating immersion. What this is saying, like, if the writer is able to do this, then the reader's more likely to identify with an outgroup, with some other identity. So I'm just wondering, can we apply this to climate fiction? Shifting from identity to climate change, of the three books here, and if we also consider Parable of the Sower, New York 2140, and Wind Up Girl, other books that we've read in the past, would any of these, in your opinion, be more effective at inducing this kind of experience taking?
I would say that it's almost unfair to compare these in this way only because with Weather, the character Lizzie, I feel, is very close to who I am. And it's a much smaller gap to get from Iad to Lizzie than to get from Iad to whoever it is in New York 2140. So to my mind, the gap matters a lot. And another thing that I don't know if this kind of accommodated for is that we're talking about a specific way of showing a character in a very straightforward novel where the character is probably sympathetic and you're supposed to be immersed in the story. There is no sort of metafictional aspect or anything like that involved.
I wonder how much the realism of a work influences this idea. Because I think I looked at this a little bit differently from how you did, Iad. For example, Weather, even though I think it was the easiest to align with, it's the most realistic as well. Because it's not set in some strange future, it's set in our present with characters that I agree I feel very similar to. But I think it speaks to a limited population, this kind of anxious urbanite type. But also, I don't think that experience taking leads anywhere, really, in that book. So I don't know how successful it is in this part of the discussion, in this experience taking. And I agree that it's kind of hard to put all of these other books in some sort of rank in that way. But I think Wu's book, The Man with the Compound Eyes, even though I think we all had a lot of problems with it, I wonder if maybe it's the most effective in this category, if only because the thing that they're dealing with, the problem they're dealing with, is the most concrete issue, this mound of trash that's floating through the ocean.
But in that novel, there are so many characters. Who are you taking? Whose experience are you taking?
Yeah, I guess I'm not looking so much at the characters themselves as I'm looking at their experiences.
For me, it is by far and away Parable of the Sower. For two main reasons. One, it is first person and kind of confessional. I think that goes very far in terms of building a bond with the reader, even though it feels hokey. The way that's written, it's like a diary. I think that's a big part of it. Another big part of it is the plot is very engrossing. Like, while you are reading the book, you are alternatively cheering or fearful for the character. And you kind of lose your sense of self when reading that book. I can't say the same for Weather, because Weather is a little bit too clever. When you read it, you're not engaging with it on that level of being engrossed. I think in order for a book like this, my understanding of it is that it has to be very engrossing. Like, you can't have that side of you that's thinking all the time and analyzing it. You have to just be in the narrative.
Then, after you finish reading Parable, do you feel that you are inclined to react to things more in the way that Lauren would, the main character of Parable of the Sower? Like, does it change your behavior outside of the novel?
I think that's the intent, right? I think she is writing the novel with the aim of wanting people to be more empathetic. Whether or not I encounter that shift, I don't know, because I never thought about, gauging how empathetic I was before and then afterwards. It's hard for me to say that I was significantly changed by it. Another book that I think does this is Britt Bennett's book. Very clearly, I think, does this. Not about climate change, but about, trans identity and Black identity. For me, that book was very effective in helping me shift my perspective. I think when we move away from, racial identity and sexual orientation to something that is more abstract, like climate change, it's actually much more difficult to do. But it's interesting. I'm just sort of wondering if it could be applied from identity to this more abstract idea. I don't know. But of the books that we've read, for me, Parable is the one that I think has the most potential for changing the way people think about environmental issues. So if we hold this study to be true, and I'd say the jury is still out. I mean, this is a relatively recent study. I don't know how much I believe it, but if we believe it to be true, do you think writers who are concerned with these kinds of ideas, who are concerned with change, should they write with these constraints in mind?
I would say, yeah. I mean, if they have a specific goal and their goal is to make people feel a certain way by engaging with their characters and change the way they behave by acting more like their characters, and they know that this is part of their toolkit, why should they not use it?
I don't know that writers need to write to the constraints exactly, but writing with them in mind, I think, is a good idea. One of my worries is that books might have to become so hyper-specific that they lose meaning or nuance. So from that study, one of the things that was discussed is that the subjects read a story that was about a character from the same university as them. Some different subjects read, I think, the same story that was written about a character from a different school, and that those produced wildly different results. That the students that read about a character that studied at the same school were more likely to take something away from that.
I have a wild idea. What if in the future you could buy an ebook and Amazon had a database that knew how old you were, where you lived, where you went to school, and when you bought the ebook, they would just insert all of these facts. That way, you would like it more because it was more like you.
This is like a Black Mirror episode in the making.
That sounds so bad.
Why? If it really works, and I think I agree with James, it's not for sure, but if it really works, what's wrong with that?
It's kind of already in place if you think about social media algorithms. Like, you are already being fed information based on what the Facebook algos think you like to read about and are more likely to, share and like. So this is kind of taking that and taking it one step further and making you more empathetic somehow.
Yeah, I don't know. If it actually works, I mean, not that idea specifically, but if this hyper specificity actually works in experience taking, then I suppose it's worth trying. But I think it says something about us as a country or even a species that we need that sort of hyper specificity in order to relate to each other. I mean, I think we already see that in aspects of life, politics and human rights being major examples.
I think that it bothers people, and here I'm just presuming that it bothers people because it begins to feel like not art in a place where they think things should be art. And something being crafted kind of on demand to suit the consumer feels more like commerce or propaganda than art. And that to me, I think is kind of an unfortunate way of looking at it because a lot of times historically when people regard things as art, they haven't been made as art. They were made for other purposes and they became art along the way, according to how people reacted to them later on. So if somebody wrote a novel and he decided to use the techniques that James had mentioned, because his goal was to create an affecting narrative that would influence people to care more about climate change, that would not bother me. It might not be a good novel, it might be very bad art, but if it worked towards that goal that he had in mind, bad art is sometimes okay. There is space in the world for bad art.
So if we take weather as an example, if you took Lizzie's character and took her out of New York and plopped her in Kansas, I mean, you'd still have to have allusions to Trump, or it wouldn't really make sense. But maybe the fears are different. Maybe they talk more about guns or something.
The part of our episode where Sam tries to figure out what Republicans are like.
Yeah. What are they?
Who are these people? Just think of King of the Hill. That's what you should be envisioning. Dale.
Propane and propane accessories. Yeah, I don't know. I get what you're saying, Ed, and I suppose it could work, even though I'm against the cheapening of art. If it achieves that purpose, especially on the heels of what we were just talking about, are we moving fast enough? If that can get us to that goal, sure, why not?
It could be used for something more nefarious. Rather than making you care about climate change, somebody could use it to turn you into a white nationalist. So the technique
That's
itself,
what I was going to say exactly.
yeah, it's not good or bad, but is this kind of where we draw the line? And I would say maybe not, but I could see how it could be done for wrong in the future.
But this has happened in the past with abolitionist fiction. You have Uncle Tom's Cabin and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. With Frederick Douglass's autobiography, people at the time were shocked because they could not believe that this was written by a black person. You know, there were conspiracy theories saying that it had to have been written by a white person, you know, like this was a fake narrative. You can see in history how effective this can be because these kinds of narratives were instrumental in getting people to change the way they think about slavery at the time. And of course, both of these narratives were, I'm pretty sure, I haven't read in a long time, first person. You knew the characters were black, so it wasn't that the outgroup identity was introduced later. But, you know, they were very engrossing. Like the reviews at the time all spoke to how captivating these novels were. So, yeah, I mean, historically, you can see that, you know, these novels can impact societal change. At the same time, having read excerpts of both of those texts, they're not very interesting to read, especially now. They're not artistically noteworthy in my mind. So I think you are sacrificing art.
Yeah, but not necessarily. I mean, you could have a good novel, and then if you knew the psychological principles at hand, you could tweak things just ever so slightly and achieve some effect. So I think the issue when it comes to art is whether you start with a good novel or not. Like most of the time, when people intend to create a social text that changes the way people think, that's their prime directive. And because of that, they don't really consider making good art at the same time.
All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the psychological impact of these novels. welcome back.
So going back a little bit to what Iad was asking, what fiction brings to the table in this discussion? I found an article in Smithsonian Magazine from a few months ago that posed some interesting questions about how climate fiction works into this.
AKA Walmart Academia.
Yeah, where does popular science fit into that?
Kmart.
One important point that the writer Anna Funk made was that if the science is outlandish or hyperbolic, it might actually be detrimental to public understanding. For example, a school in the UK did a study on viewers of the movie The Day After Tomorrow, which I don't know if you remember. It was about the world pretty much freezing overnight.
Notable for being one of the top 10 scientifically inaccurate films, according to Yahoo Movies.
And to that point, they found that while the viewers were initially more concerned about climate change, they ended up feeling like they wouldn't experience it in their lifetimes. Or when they learned about what climate change actually was, that it wasn't that bad by comparison. And so we can look at this in other things too, not just climate fiction, but stories about genetic engineering, such as with Jurassic Park or superhero movies too. So do you feel like we have realistic representation in these novels that we've read?
I would say in weather, yes, but I think the caveat there is it's not showing you the thing that needs to be done realistically. There isn't really a scientific aspect to that novel. But in terms of a children's Bible and The Man with the Compound Eyes, I would say no. I think those two are accelerated, probably for a dramatic effect.
Definitely not in The Man with the Compound Eyes, because the event of a trash island smashing into Taiwan is so tale and absurd that you can't really believe in it.
It hasn't happened yet, but we still have that trash island floating out there. It just hasn't smashed into any islands because of how the currents work.
Well, that book makes my top 10 of scientifically outlandish books that we've read this year. It does feel very hyperbolic to depict a trash island smashing into Taiwan.
But then, James, are you like these dum-dums who watch The Day After Tomorrow and who like, oh, it's not going to get cold overnight, so it's okay?
Yeah, after I read the book, I went and threw out more plastic.
But these people who had this problem with the movie, like, I guess this was like in 2004, right? When that movie came out. Maybe people just didn't know very much, but I feel like if you're relying on one movie, of course you're not going to get the complete picture. But who's relying on just one movie?
I disagree with you, Iad. I think a children's Bible was not that outlandish. I mean, for me, what makes the book interesting is that it did straddle that line between the real and the magical. It did feel quite real until people started disappearing.
I have to say here, I'm not a scientist, so I can't prove anything here or back this up with data, but in my understanding of that novel, it was like there was a switch. And once the switch had been flipped, everything started happening. It wasn't gradual. And it wasn't like a bunch of really crazy shit started happening like The Day After Tomorrow, but it was still like a switch had been flipped.
I think we talked in that episode, this past summer and the summer before, we had weather patterns like what happened in that book.
Crazy flooding in the Northeast this year in 2021.
And different things happening in different parts of the world too, not just in the US.
And yet here we are sitting comfortably recording a podcast.
But in that book, it suggested that things were ending, but we only saw a partial collapse of society. We saw a very small section of society collapsing, but they still had television and stuff. Some things were still functioning.
Let's put it on a spectrum, because I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's like The Day After Tomorrow, but it's also not like weather. It is a little bit different from the way I understand science, but it's not like I have to pretend to be stupid to enjoy it.
I also found New York 2140 to be relatable and not that outlandish, despite it being set in the future. And despite its political underpinnings, I thought it was believable. I didn't think it was crazy that these things would happen.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. When I was thinking about this, at first I thought that it did feel outlandish, but all that really has happened is that some glaciers have melted and sea level has risen, 10 meters or something like that? And that's actually pretty realistic.
So if this is really a concern, though, like we want to be realistic, does that mean that we outlaw hyperbole? Like, what are the consequences of this type of thinking?
I think they have different end goals, right? I mean, if we look at the man with the compound eyes, and if we consider that outlandish, I think we can still see something relevant there. I think we can still see how a swirling trash island could be pretty terrible. As outlandish as it is, I think he gives some good explanations of why it could bring about something cataclysmic eventually.
I agree, but I guess to go back to this school in the UK that we're watching the day after tomorrow, like if there is a lesson to be learned there, I don't really know what it is because it's like, yes, people can get the wrong idea, but most people can recognize hyperbole as hyperbole and move on. So, what are we supposed to do? What's the takeaway?
I think the finding of that study is that they didn't understand hyperbole.
Time to write a letter to the editor. Smithsonian Mag, I got a big problem for you. I agree that people do get confused, but I think that it's kind of a leveling thing. Like, we're smart guys and we know what's true and what's not true, and we check our facts and we don't believe everything that we read. And for us, everything's going great. And I'm sure there are people out there who don't check their facts, and for them, it's not going great. But do we kill our experience to save them or what? Like, it just doesn't sit right with me.
I guess it depends on the aim of the book. I think someone like Robinson probably doesn't want to deal in things that are too outlandish because he's looking for real change. So he's trying to give solutions to real issues. I think Wu Mingyi would feel the same way.
Yeah, if you're interested in depicting the spectacle, that's different. So, Sam, are you depressed now, having read these 3 books and having had this conversation about how fiction won't change anything?
Yeah, I am wondering if these books present like an overall optimistic or pessimistic view of our future. Does this give you hope for our future, or is this casting a big shadow over everything?
I just think back to Jenny Offel's point about how it takes, just like 3% of people to start creating change. And, if that's my big takeaway from the series, I'm okay with it. That's hopeful enough.
So to borrow her idea, as she put it, the obligatory notes of hope, do those balance out the doom and gloom?
It's not about balance for me. It's about partitioning, because I think that's the point of weather, that, the world you live in is so depressing that you just have to kind of find a way to cope. And one way to cope is by watching Squid Game on Netflix. You just kind of forget about everything else.
Right, because nothing says coping with a bad future than focusing on the problems of capitalism.
Well, what does Compound Eyes leave us with?
To me, that shows the destruction of an entire culture, the slow eradication of another one, and the suggestion that it's coming for us all next if we don't do anything. So happy?
Yeah.
I mean, if wonderful translator Daryl Stirk is to believe, the novel is a kind of test that we have all failed. And basically, we can't really understand nature and how to live inside of nature. So, to my mind, it's just another way of saying we're fucked. For me, the issue is like, I am trying to have a kid now, and I am not so sure that's the right thing to do. It's a serious thought in my mind. Like, number one, is this the world that you want to live in? Number two, do more people living on this planet solve the problem or make it worse?
So more climate fiction, anyone?
I actually would like to read more, not because I feel like I need more, but because it's satisfying in the way that crying when you hear a sad song is satisfying.
You, the most hard-hearted among us, crying?
Yeah, I would cry from time to time, only when it's really necessary.
Like when you listen to Wonderwall?
Not Wonderwall, no, like real sad stuff.
Even though I kind of feel the same way as Ed in that I don't feel like I need to, I think what I like is the reframing of certain arguments in different ways. Reframing what the problem is and maybe what some solutions could be. I do like seeing other takes to that.
All right, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be starting our next series, Bad Adaptation, where we discuss good books that were turned into bad movies. We'll start with Highrise by Jg Ballard. We've got an updated reading schedule. You can find that on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we also post threads for our book club discussion every Friday. If you'd like to talk about climate fiction with us, you can find us there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and leave us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That'll help us grow the community. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.